It doesn't feel like your dog is ignoring you when it begins, and that is exactly why the change is so easy to miss, because the behavior still appears correct on the surface. Your dog still hears you, still responds, and still behaves in ways that feel familiar enough not to question. But something has already shifted in the way your dog is responding to you, and that shift does not appear in whether they respond, but in how the response begins. It sits in the moment before action, and that moment begins to repeat. You notice it when you give a cue, because your dog hears you, looks at you, and then pauses briefly before doing anything else. The response still comes, but it does not begin immediately, and that difference begins to build. That difference does not disappear once it appears. It repeats. There was a time when your dog responded without interruption, where your cue and their action were connected without anything sitting between them. Now something sits in that space, and even though it is small, it becomes consistent. You notice it in movement, because your dog begins to act before fully aligning with you, rather than aligning first and then acting. The behavior still corrects, but the correction happens after the movement begins. You see it again when you stop moving, because your dog continues forward slightly before adjusting back toward you. The adjustment still happens, but it no longer defines the beginning of the action. Now the same pattern appears in recall, where your dog hears you, acknowledges you, and then pauses before responding. The response still happens, but it no longer begins from the same place. That change does not stay isolated. It spreads. You begin to notice it across different interactions, not tied to one moment, but tied to the way your dog processes your cues. It appears during movement, during stillness, and during transitions where there used to be no interruption. At this point, everything still feels normal, because the outcome remains consistent and nothing has visibly broken. But the internal structure of behavior has already changed, and that structure is what matters. Because your dog is no longer moving from certainty. They are moving from a decision. That decision happens before the action begins, even if it only takes a fraction of a second, and it becomes consistent enough to shape behavior over time. Once it becomes part of the sequence, it replaces what used to be automatic. Now the pattern becomes more noticeable, not because it becomes larger, but because it becomes more frequent. Your dog hears, processes, and then acts, creating a sequence that repeats consistently. That repetition gives the moment weight. And once it has weight, it becomes structure. Most people don't notice this shift because the behavior still appears correct on the surface. But behavior is not defined by the outcome alone, it is defined by how that outcome begins. And that beginning has already changed. Your dog is still responding, but not from the same internal position, and that difference introduces variation into how responses feel. Some remain immediate, while others carry a slight delay. That variation is not random. It is structured. Because your dog is no longer reacting automatically to your cue, but evaluating before acting, even if that evaluation is brief. And once evaluation replaces instinct, behavior becomes conditional. Now the interaction begins to feel slightly different, even if it is difficult to explain clearly at first. The connection is still there, but it lacks immediacy, and the responses feel slightly removed. That feeling is not imagined, because it reflects a real shift in how behavior is being generated. Your dog is still engaged, still aware, but no longer anchored to the same starting point. Because what has changed is not whether your dog responds, but where the response begins, and that difference carries through everything that follows. Your dog is still doing what you ask, but the action no longer starts from the same place. And once the starting point changes, the pattern builds in ways that feel small at first but become consistent over time. It builds quietly, without conflict, but with enough repetition to stabilize. Now that moment is no longer occasional. It is expected. And once it becomes expected, it becomes part of the relationship, shaping how your dog responds over time. Because by the time you notice it clearly, it has already been happening for a while. What you are seeing now is not the beginning of the change, but the moment it becomes visible enough to recognize. And the moment your dog appears to ignore you is the moment everything has already shifted.